My name is Amy Drayer. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am a web developer for the University of Minnesota Libraries and have that master's degree in library and information science. Today, I am wearing a colorful striped top and I have long brown curly hair. I am a Caucasian female. I've had the privilege to work on many projects over the past 2 decades. IT solutions for faculty, library and IT solutions for the military. I've worked on a team to build an online library catalog from scratch, and now a design system to create shared guidance for web work within my organization. This is all to say I've had a few opportunities to consider ethics in web design, especially with some of the like military. You'd be surprised at how many mistakes everyone makes. Minnesota is located on the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Anishinaabe and Dakota peoples, the original stewards of this territory. We are committed to uplifting the name of these lands and the community members whose nations reside alongside us. We acknowledge the trauma that is deeply embedded in the United States. The land we reside on came under control of the United States through genocide, slavery, and ongoing occupation. We recognize the deep historical, spiritual, and personal trauma that has impacted Indigenous communities, communities of color, and immigrant communities. By offering this acknowledgement of trauma, we affirm the right of people to bring their whole selves and stories into this space, and we affirm our intention to promote healing, respect, and love. Why is this statement important? The work we do on the web is for people, and people are complex with a broad range of lived experiences and inherited stories. They experience privilege and oppression. Recognizing the injustices in our past and present help us to recognize how they manifest in our work and perspectives. And we can focus on building technologies that improve the experience of all people. Before we can consider sustainability's role in an ethical web framework, I'd like to examine the question, what is ethical web design? This isn't going to be a deep dive into philosophical semantics and theorizing, though there's certainly a place for that in this conversation. Many of us here are doing ethical work on the web, whether we've considered it as such or not. Sometimes we just know it's the right thing to do. So to answer our question, what is ethical web design? Simply put, ethical web design is designing for the well-being of the person consuming the content. Now, this works from my understanding for applying some practical practices and convincing others to do the work alongside me. In your journey, you may develop a different understanding or perspective of what ethical may mean in your web work. While my definition centers the human experience, it's strongly rooted in planetary survival. Jerry McGovern suggested inverting the customer experience pyramid, placing you on the bottom, the organization next, then the user above that. Then he adds a new, much larger layer that is the earth, which, as Jerry puts it, we are treating extraordinarily badly. The oppressions people experience cannot be fully resolved until we repair our relationship with Earth, because ultimately, Earth is who has to sustain us. I have no doubt that Earth can live without us. So what do we give back to Earth for that gift of life? And then how do we repair our relationship with each other? For me, when I first started playing on the web, it was literally that. We were playing, exploring and experimenting with what we could do. There wasn't much thought about other people experiencing that work. We started to take into consideration different device sizes and capabilities, but with a browser as consumer model rather than a person as consumer need. We build because we can. We don't often ask why or should we. But as Mike Montero said in a 2013 presentation, this is how bad design makes it out into the world, not due to malicious intent, but having no intent at all. Ethics is our work. It manifests in the daily decisions we make, whether great or small. As I said, mostly people feel like they're doing good. And yet in the past decade, we've witnessed some staggering ethical issues. Women and social justice advocates stalked and harassed, receiving death threats, supposedly protected under free speech here in the US. Misinformation and disinformation campaigns rolling through Twitter and Facebook and other platforms. Huge data breaches. Big data, perhaps unwittingly, utilized to oppress Black, Indigenous, and people of color, also known as BIPOC. These systems lacking open feedback loops to analyze whether these were built upon already biased data, which they were, or whether they were generating imperfect analyses, which they are. These systems are deepening the bias and oppression through assumptions that the data is clean and worthy of use. The web is growing at unprecedented rates. 17 million websites in 2000, 206 million a decade later, and now about 1.8 billion websites exist. People are calling for degrowth. We have other problems based in lack of awareness or lack of realization that web work can cause oppression. It's just code, right? In 2018, over 2,300 lawsuits in the US were filed against inaccessible websites. In 2020, that went up to over 3,500. We can easily oppress entire communities with uninformed code. That would be like people trying to access a website with screen reader, people with low vision or no vision. As I share this ethical framework I've been working on for a few years, please recognize that this is a journey of self-discovery and meaning within your life and work. Your journey and priorities may be completely different. This is such an organic process, continual evolution in the tools and the ways we utilize those tools to enable others. The web, I feel, is ready to mature. We're seeing where the lack of real intent or established ethics is failing us as an industry, but also as a civilization. And we're starting to see this maturation happening. So I break down ethical web design into 7 primary principles, which is driving our own design system development. They are universally accessible, honest, inclusive, mindful, private, simple, and sustainable. And I'll go over these in more detail. Universally accessible. Deliver content and services where barriers to access are removed for all people to use, regardless of technology, format, or methods of delivery. Avoid building to one way of doing or being. Build to be understandable in a way that allows us to be human and make errors. Honest. Be transparent. Provide only accurate content written with non-biased language and clearly identify opinionated content. Fight disinformation or the act of intentionally deceiving in content and algorithms. Inclusive. Lead with person-first design, designing with people, not for them. Be aware of our own biases and assumptions and recognize we are not the user. Embrace people as complex beings where average doesn't exist. Mindful. Make decisions that prioritize user well-being. Don't build to steal attention, and avoid dark and anti-patterns. The farther you pull someone from their task, the harder it is for them to do it. This is particularly important for cognitive accessibility. Private. Promote and ensure privacy through security and personal data ownership. Provide these tenets in systems and services to the best of our ability and be transparent where we cannot. Simple. Simple doesn't mean easy or dumbed down. Simple is challenging. It's curating and cultivating the message concisely and clearly. It's discovering the most elegant semantic technical solution and the intentional use of the resources available. And sustainable. Factor in energy source and consumption for optimizations from server to client side. Just as people do not deserve a reduced experience, our planet does not deserve to suffer the consequences of bad design and web delivery. Sustainability is as much about our planet's well-being as it is our own, as they are intertwined. So defining these principles is an organic, ongoing process as we explore and better understand this work in practice. So what principles would you adopt to create an ethical web framework? With this list, what would you change? And how do each of these support planetary wellness? So I'm going to actually put these questions into chat. And please share your thoughts if you're comfortable, or I'll give everyone a moment to think about it. It's not too early anywhere else, is it? I'm fine if people are interested in eating lunches and dinners over a dialogue at the moment. But if anyone does feel, hold on, sustainability is particularly important, especially with AI applications being very energy intensive. I so much agree with that. AI and cryptocurrency haven't really thought much about energy consumption. And then Hannah mentions the thing you said really resonated is, oh yes, cognitive accessibility, and not stealing people's attention from the job in hand. Yeah. It's one thing to consider how much time is being taken from someone, but it's another to consider how detrimental that might be to someone who has a hard time processing already. So it can be a real showstopper for some people. It's a huge part of my work that I'm doing at the Green Software Foundation and Microsoft. Oh, that's wonderful. I'm really glad there are people thinking about this. I'm working on a similar idea for a responsible product development framework. Oh, wonderful. And I've come to some very similar conclusions. I'd love to read what you have. I think it's also important to promote diversity in teams that create these products. Yes, and that's the foundation of the inclusive principle about building with people instead of for them. That principle, I had a lot more text on it originally, in which we're like, if you can't find diverse teams, then you need to hire people to help bring those other perspectives in, and simplified it for sake of time. But yes, it's so important, and teams are stronger for it, for having diversity in there. Wonderful, thank you so much. Oh, Abhishek says, we adopt even a code with methodology to extend the design with people approach and have gotten much better results in terms of the inclusive outcomes. Exactly. It's amazing how hard it is to convince companies that this actually really does improve your product to have a diverse team. Yeah, I was curious about that too. What code with methodology is.
Yeah, I can chime in if I may.
Yeah.
So the idea of code with is basically, when we're working with customers, getting their fingerprints in the code just as much as ours. So typically, at least in the team that I work in, our approach, in a normal situation would have been to develop a solution and then to, quote unquote, present it to the other party who has, hired us to build whatever solution for them. But we realized that that was rife with problems because we were making assumptions about, how those tools were going to be used. And as you said, right, we're not necessarily the users of those tools in the first place, or at least we're not the prototypical users for the tools. So we realized that bringing them in as a part of the development workflow, so not just design of the solutions, but actually writing the code for the solutions. One of the biggest positive outcomes from that has been that the folks for whom we're building those solutions have a much better understanding of how the solution works, and hence they're able to adapt and continue tailoring the solution better rather than having to almost be stuck with something that's been provided to them by someone who's not a first party in that sense.
I love it. Wonderful, Abhishek. Thank you for sharing that and clarifying. Yeah, and Deepak mentions efficient, or is efficient code how you achieve sustainability? So we'll see some of this once we get a little farther into my presentation, but I struggled with the word simple. And so did a lot of people, which is why I had to put in it's not dumbed down. It's you taking all the extra words out or the extra code out to really hone in and make it as simple and efficient as possible. So somewhat interchangeable, but efficient might be a better word than simple based on how much I've had to explain. It's not about making the message, less. Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'll have to take a look at that framework, the responsible framework afterwards. There are also energy considerations, even for different programming languages. So efficient code isn't always directly translated into energy efficiency. That is so true. I use jQuery for the longest time because of how easy, how efficient that code is from a writing perspective. Totally not efficient from an energy perspective. Okay, so let's get moving, but feel free to continue having this conversation in chat. So as we've been building out designs and thinking intentionally about these principles, I've noticed some intersectionalities, and this is where we'll start to see some of that, the efficiencies. Okay, a note on intersectionality. Black feminist and critical race scholar Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality in the late 1980s in the context of the rise of critical race legal studies. The term has also traveled and developed well beyond legal studies to counter unidimensional and exclusionary analyses of oppression in many disciplines. Now, acknowledging the origin of this idea, I'm going to apply it to the framework, focusing on the interplay of each principle more than the oppression consequences. So following are several ethical intersections. Elegant accessibility. David Henko Reed presented on this concept at the Inclusive Design 24 conference. In a nutshell, elegant accessibility means using semantic HTML. Does anyone know how many HTML5 elements exist? It's about 112. How many do you know and use? I won't make anyone answer that out loud, but I mean, just think about that for a moment. Now, code should only have a handful of, at most, of divs and spans. That's great, Hannah, 60 or 70, that's great. But we want to reduce the number of divs and spans. Leonie Watson described building a custom link using a span element as needing 80% more code than using the native HTML anchor element because you had to recreate the functionality and the styles. Widely known secret here. Native HTML has functionality baked in. Functionality that includes accessibility. Heading elements like the H1 and H2 provide document outline and navigation to jump through the content, improving accessibility by default. If you're writing code to act like a button, don't use a div. Use the button element. A browser already knows what it is. And you won't need a lot of JavaScript and ARIA to have it work properly. Using semantic elements reduces overall complexity. It's a simpler solution. And while frameworks offer us nearly all the solutions we need, they're solving for everyone's use cases. And in doing so are nearly always much larger than we need. Consider not using a framework like Bootstrap or jQuery and build leaner code towards your actual needs. There will be a quiz on just how many elements you know in HTML at the end of this, just so you know. I'm just kidding. By using less code, the web page uses less energy. Each bit requires electricity to exist. In UTF-8 encoding, one character can take 1 to 4 bytes. Less code will require less electricity to exist on a server and for delivery and consumption. Web pages with less code are likely to be smaller, faster, use fewer resources, and are more sustainable, both to maintain as well as for the planet. User experience can be Earth experience. Some may disagree. Golden Krishna wrote an entire book, The Best Interface is No Interface. I agree with Krishna. And while I wish we could turn off the screens, we are in an age of digital user experiences and they need attention. What we can do to make our experiences align with Earth's experiences is to reduce friction within the user journey. At times, we need friction to make someone pause before taking an action. But mostly we need to get someone to the most useful content with as little effort on their and the underlying technology's behalf. Focusing on a frictionless journey for tasks reduces the chances of chaotic clicking and overall time spent completing a task. That creates a mindful experience. This user-centric, task-based, content-first approach applied to navigation, content, and information architecture reduces fluff and increases simplicity, and hopefully becomes more inclusive once we're outside our own heads and prioritizing others and Earth. Once we've spent time and effort to work towards the person and not ourselves. Readable content. We want people to read our content mostly. In order to have readable content, experts recommend writing at a US 7th or 8th grade reading level. Just because someone can read at a PhD level doesn't mean we enjoy doing so for everything. Use shorter words under 3 or 4 syllables, wordsmith to simplify the message, and utilize space and content chunking. Writing content isn't so hard. Writing readable content is challenging. Some other tips for readable writing in English. Sentence length should vary, but be no more than 20 to 25 words on average. Line length is best between 40 and 70 characters long. Use active voice. If the sentence begins with "it is," rewrite it. Vary the format to avoid large blocks of text. Bullet points are great for this. People often scan headings and bullet points to determine scope and usefulness of the content. By writing for readability, we're making the content more accessible to everyone, but especially to folks with cognitive and learning disabilities. Also follow other typography best practices for appropriate font size, proper spacing, and alignment. We're mindful of people's time and attention by writing fewer and smaller words. We're taking the time instead to distill our message so our readers don't need to use their time doing so. And by using smaller words and a clearer message with fewer words, we are inherently writing with fewer characters. Fewer characters means fewer bytes of data requiring less energy. A clear message makes a sustainable web in, again, both maintenance and planetary health. Good performance is good. Through writing good code, content, and other optimizations, we can improve performance. We make the web more performant for a variety of reasons, primarily to retain visitors. It's well proven that if a site takes longer than a couple seconds to load, people will leave. An altruistic side effect is sites may also be more available to a wider audience. They may load on more devices with varying connectivity. So it's somewhat more inclusive, though often not intentionally. Be aware of any third-party JavaScript libraries and remove what you can. Tracking and advertising scripts are costly in CPU, privacy, security, and aren't what people want. I've never heard someone say, "Why doesn't this website have ads? I like ads." Because performance sometimes means perceived load time and not the complete load time, does good performance also mean less energy consumption or more sustainable? A recent paper has confirmed there is a correlation, and Chris Coyer, founder of the CSS Tricks website, suggested we follow the W3C's rule of least power. But generally, good performance also often means less energy and more sustainable. One method to achieve a more performant web is by setting a performance budget. To do this, we need to know what the current performance is. using the incognito window. You can use the network tab and the performance tab to record how large files are and how many. There are online tools that can do this for you as well and give you grades, because that's fun. From there, we can determine where savings can be made. Focus on most visited pages first, and once goals are set, add an ongoing auditing process by setting a monthly date to manually capture numbers, or automate it by adding a script to capture the data. So I'm just seeing Abhishek included a fantastic library for privacy-friendly analytics using Fathom Analytics. I've not heard of Fathom. We've switched to something called Matomo, which is open source, so we can install it on our own servers and had complete control over that. And it honors people's settings to not track, unlike Google Analytics. And speaking of analytical compromises, we like website visit counts. And what better than a comprehensive free tool like Google Analytics? But when have you last used those numbers to create a more meaningful experience for visitors? So Jerry McGovern recently published a 4-part article titled Calculating the Pollution Costs of Website Analytics. He sets 1 gigabyte of data transmission as 0.0042 kilograms of pollution. He calculated the transfer of visitor data, the storage of the data, and processing of it, and found Google would have to plant 3.77 million trees annually to address its carbon impact. The sheer amount of CO2 Google Analytics generates and how the code may slow down the website performance, which draws some inclusion concerns, draw sustainability concerns as well. And is this service free? McGovern writes, you think you are getting Google Analytics for free, when in fact, Google is using you to track people, because selling the data they get from tracking people is how they make 90% of their revenue. So getting these services by selling our visitors' data leads to privacy loss and less trust. One last item to ponder. Jerry also wrote recently that nearly 80% of the data we collect, we don't use. And another 10% we don't access after the first 3 months. Linking SEO optimization. Aside from addressing data collection, there's other machine aspects to consider. As the person needs to navigate a website efficiently, machines need to interpret content meaningfully to parse data for search results. But search engine robots aren't the only machines. Assistive technology are machines that improve the accessibility experience, and AI, which for some projects may improve mindfulness by surfacing relevant information with fewer clicks or no clicks if using a voice-activated service. Links build the web of the internet, but they mean much less if the link text is click here or read more or other much less descriptive text. Algorithms need meaningful and honest link text as much as humans do. Use Nielsen-Norman Group's 4 S's for links: specific, sincere, substantial, and succinct. Remember, the more obvious and readable a link is, the more confident people are in whether it's for them. Now back to simplifying through semantic HTML. Using HTML5 landmarks such as main, nav, and footer, and content semantics like proper headings, buttons, and link elements better informs machines what the content is. It's not going to understand the span element that's pretending to be an anchor. Typography selection. there's little evidence that dyslexic designed fonts can help a broad audience of people experiencing dyslexia. The readability group confirmed at this year's AXCON conference, which is on accessibility, that dyslexic fonts are not ideal as a default. Some research has shown, however, that the most commonly used typefaces may be helpful because of the amount of exposure, and so generally are more legible. For copy text, consider using a sans serif native or system font set, such as Verdana and Arial. System and native fonts do not fail to load over unstable internet connections, which makes them more universal and inclusive. Going with a system or native typeface probably doesn't sound appealing. Legible custom fonts such as Atkinson Hyperlegible from the Braille Institute or Public Sans may improve accessibility, but consider that modern CSS gives us finer control over spacing and other typographic elements that could refresh common fonts. If we remove 1 or 2 custom fonts, that's fewer resource requests over the network. For required custom fonts, you can also remove unneeded variants such as demi-bold, which reduces font file size. Reducing resource requests and file sizes means less energy. You can see how these all kind of build on top of each other. Accessibility is aesthetic. There's an argument that accessible design cannot be aesthetic. I'm going to debunk that. Accessible design can be aesthetic. You may notice that accessibility and sustainability are actually strongly linked. So could a similar argument be made about sustainable design? I have to admit, having both accessibility and sustainability in mind can make design surprisingly challenged to create a modern feel, though more from sustainability reductions. But that is a challenge worth accepting. I kind of miss having shadows, for instance. But CSS can do so much more today. But it's also easy to fall into some performance traps that can detract from inclusiveness and sustainability. Simplify. We often write rules over rules or don't remove obsolete CSS. To help organize the code to reduce that, consider using partial files, but avoid using the @import feature since each of these is a resource request. Rather, mash the partials through a build management tool like Gulp, or amalgamate and cache server-side using like a content management system. Avoid the bang important feature unless for utility classes, print style sheets, or debugging. And if you have a build process, be sure to include an uglification step for production. Simplify selectors. If you have code like hashtag this -1, hashtag that -thing, period, this -button, span. I mean, that's one selector. If you have that, your code may need a cleanup. Remove IDs from your selectors. Instead, identify components and focus on using a parent class and then identify children of that class. Use fun features like :not, the tilde for siblings, the plus sign for adjacent siblings, first child, only child, nth child, first of type, last of type, nth of type, specifying based on attribute existence or a match on an attribute value, which you'll have more of if coding accessibly. There's not much need for granular classes and IDs anymore. And use modern layout techniques. Flexbox and grid are amazing. You can create a complex, responsive layout with CSS3 grid in a few short lines of code. Similarly with Flexbox. And CSS does animation. But as with any animation, it requires the client's CPU to process. If the animation must be there, keep it brief, set a finite time, provide some control to the user, and honor reduced motion settings to improve accessibility. Other properties that can cause significant CPU computations include border radius, box shadow, text shadow, opacity, transform, filter, and position fixed. When we use these, the computer is handling all the math behind it, and repainting can see higher power usage. So use these mindfully. Media overload. Page weight has grown exponentially through increased use of media. In this, sustainable practices create a wave of other benefits, primarily based on optimizations and overall reduction. Consider the purpose of every graphic, video, and sound. Only keep them if they add genuine value. Each of these requires much more ongoing maintenance as their content becomes outdated or formats change by Flash, than simple text updates, so we can be more mindful of content developers' time as well. Media poses challenges for several disabilities. Images need good descriptions for low or no vision people. Video is distracting, but especially for people with attention disorders, and is far more problematic if video autoplays or the controls are hard to use with a keyboard or don't exist, which often happens when video is used as a background. Please don't do this. For video and sound, give control to users. This way they can opt in to that heavy content and they can prepare for when it happens by putting on headphones, adjusting the volume, or finding a quiet or private corner. This also means people won't have to rewind to catch what they missed by scrambling to set up for it. Accessibility is mindful design. On the other end, people experiencing some cognitive disorders benefit from graphics, so we need to find a balance for media use. And please include labels with icons. Including alternate ways to reach the content is inclusive. People don't have to play the media at all, especially to get a quick answer. Provide a transcript. This also improves accessibility, SEO optimization because Google can read text, and generally makes people happy when they can search what they're looking for. Also, captions are required for video, which helps everyone. Some of this content could be simplified or briefer and so much more manageable and easier for consumption. Folks are more willing to consume a 2-minute video rather than a 20-minute video. And video often loses its potency after 2 to 5 minutes anyway. Not only is this simple, but it's mindful of people's time and attention. By reducing how much media we use, stopping autoplay on video, adding labels to images that supports no image experiences, and simplifying media, the web page requires less energy to exist. I know I'm running out of time and I have so much more to say. So we will stop when I'm told to stop. But until that happens, we'll continue. Let's take a more technical look at images since they are the most widely used media. I highly recommend using SVG where possible, since it's mutable and can be embedded in the HTML, reducing resource requests. I'd say most logos, icons, and illustrations should be SVG. In this example, this image has meaning, so it's wrapped in the figure element. This gives another container to work with, but also the fig caption element for a visible caption. We aren't just designing for screen readers here. We're designing for all types of people. The browser will read the picture's child elements in order. So the newest and most optimized format, WebP, is listed first. Keep an eye out for adoption of newer formats, AVIF and JPEG XL. Some folks will want to create different versions of each image at different browser widths and may be worth accounting for retina displays if the image relies on crispness. I tend to avoid that because each version needs to exist on a server, and that takes up energy. The last child in the picture element is the default IMG image element. This is the fallback format, and the other formats will adopt some of its attributes. We need to define a height and width for the lazy loading feature so the browser can make a placeholder for best efficiency. And the image requires alternate text with the alt attribute, and like the WebP will adopt that if the WebP can be used. All right, so here are potential savings we can get for photos. There's a few more tricks in here. Take the original image, save to a lower quality JPEG, and compress it. I use kraken.io. Set the image to the correct dimensions. An image that'll display at 800 pixels should be 800 pixels. Set to black and white. We could reduce contrast and apply a contrast filter via CSS, though you'll get mixed results either in quality or in real energy savings. For photos that have a central focal point, like my head, you can blur the edges some. Though we don't see as much savings with these last few steps, by this point, every byte counts. With all that work, the file is now 25% of the basic compressed JPEG from step 1. And now if we provide the WebP format, that file becomes 17 kilobytes, 12% of the file size from step 1. But of course, the smallest file size is no file. Images may be used to break up content, but adequate white space, font size, and text chunking will alleviate some of those needs. All right, this one's fun. Dark patterns. From the website darkpatterns.org, dark patterns are tricks used in websites and apps that make you do things that you didn't mean to, like buying or signing up for something. One example is confirm shaming, where the option to decline something is worded in such a way as to shame the user into compliance. For example, yes, send me the meal plan, or no thanks, I don't like delicious food. Dark patterns fail nearly all ethical principles. Shell Little, inclusive design lead at Wells Fargo, who is neurodivergent, refers to them as microaggressions. I think sometimes they're macroaggressions. But anyway, they're often not accessible and can trap keyboard or assistive tech users and can truly disable people with cognitive or emotional impairments. They're often offensive, making them not inclusive, dishonest. They aren't people first. It's unnecessary added code. We can't trust it. And people who think these techniques are acceptable aren't building them to be understandable. Okay, so these principles all come back to the well-being of people as the primary focus, which helps a broader audience appreciate them, since Westernized people are fairly homocentric. Every one of these principles does improve all our well-being, even if folks aren't ready to consider the catastrophic consequences of ignoring the planet or realizing it in a finite setting. The Native American people, the Potawatomi, understand our relationship with other beings where humans are the student and plants and other species are the teachers. Robin Kimmerer, in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, writes that each person, human or no, is bound to every other in a reciprocal relationship. Just as all beings have a duty to me, I have a duty to them. If an animal gives its life to feed me, I am in turn bound to support its life. If I receive a stream's gift of pure water, then I am responsible for returning a gift in kind. An integral part of a human's education is to know those duties and how to perform them. I personally take this Potawatomi approach to nature. All beings, plants, animals, and ecosystems communicate in their own ways, and they need us to listen. So I'm just going to take a quick look. I see that we have 5 minutes, and I still have an entire section that I haven't even reached. So I'm going to pause right here and ask how we want to proceed.
You can keep going, Amy.
Okay.
If people have something, they're free to drop out. But for people who are willing to stay, feel free to stay.
Okay. I really appreciate everyone's time and attention for this. I'm not even following my own mindful principle. I just had so much to say. Okay, so how do we respect this web of life through our work? Let's start by bringing ethics into our work. The first step is to recognize and embrace that we aren't perfect, and we need to continue to grow and learn and do better. It's about accepting that we make mistakes and being okay with it and growing from that learned experience and sincerely apologizing when we hurt others. Maya Angelou sums this up best. Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Once you've embraced that we're all imperfect beings in a continually changing environment, we can start thinking about where we can grow. We do this through exploring, observing, and finding community. Think about the experiences that have impacted you online, and then how they might impact someone else, such as a single parent holding a crying child, trying to one-handedly complete a task on their phone. Thinking through this can take time. We need to challenge our own beliefs, what we think is true, and hold it up against other perspectives. Being aware of our own biases and how that leads to assumptions in our logic can break down our current understanding. You may want to investigate what biases exist and how they may be influencing you. I encourage you to check out the Ethical Explorer, which provides some tools to start thinking about this. Spotify has developed an ethics assessment worksheet, and CalmTech also has some exercises to get you thinking. Once you have some ideas, analyze your own work and what in it might reflect our imperfect understanding or might fail to meet what we feel is right. For instance, let's say your marketing director has required a modal pop-up for their newsletter that covers the content right after the page loads. This is a dark pattern, and mostly we know this is bad practice. It annoys people, doesn't give them a chance to even see the content first, and may make the content completely inaccessible. Do we implement it anyway? How do we construct a response that benefits everyone? In 2018, Morten Rand Hendrickson wrote an article titled Using Ethics in Web Design. In it, he wrote 4 questions as a basis of an ethical framework for design decisions. They may help you with decisions you make about your own work on the web. Oh gosh, I don't know if I want to go to Fortune. Abhishek just mentioned that they are horrible violators of this. So those 4 questions are, what world are you building for your visitors? What capabilities are you granting or enabling? What kind of person do you become by doing this? And is that the kind of person you aspire to be? Would you want every other person in your position to make the same decision you just made? Are you upholding your duties of care? Does this improve the lives of everyone affected? Once you have some thoughts about what you want to stand for and see represented in your work, write them down. As Natalie Patterson, a poet and teaching artist, says, the act of writing is an act of manifestation. Make it real. It could be as simple as writing them on a Post-it note. I started mine as a gist on GitHub and finally felt like I had some direction and guiding principles. They are specific and actionable. They can be aspirational. Once I had my preliminary list, I shared it with my supervisor. And thankfully, he was supportive. By making him aware of my interests, it helped us to have future dialogues. Next, commit to this work. I had been going through an advanced diversity certification that required a stated commitment to pass. And so while I felt I was already committed to the work, I chose to wear what is called the iron ring. The iron ring is used by Canadian engineers, according to Wikipedia's entry on it. The ring symbolizes the pride which engineers have in their profession, while simultaneously reminding them of their humility. The ring serves as a reminder to the engineer and others of the engineer's obligation to live by a high standard of professional conduct. Of course, I'm not suggesting everyone go buy a ring all Beyonce style, but I do suggest finding a way to remind yourself daily of this commitment to work towards your goals. The hardest step is how to practically apply that work and convince others of those efforts when necessary. Changing your own work offers some flexibility in implementation, but when those decisions require outside input, you may find it more challenging. So focus on what you can do first and push yourself to find ways to inject your principles into your work. Keeping in community with others like those in climate action and tech can help. So for instance, I write all my code to be accessible. Semantic code works better for assistive technology and reduces code bloat if done well, which helps with sustainability. In many cases, I'm the only one who touches that code and manages it. So I can use that space as a place to learn and figure out how to do better. At McGill. So Abhishek mentions the iron ring is a big part of the conclusion of the engineering program at McGill, my alma mater. The ring comes from the metal from a fallen bridge. Oh my gosh. To remind engineers of the ethics of their work and responsibility to those who you are building for. And I would argue that we are engineers. We're engineers of experiences, online experiences. Even with our commitment written as something tangible in this world, we know that actions speak louder than words. Which brings us to our next step, where I'll get more personal about my journey. I was researching things on my own, but I felt like I should be able to apply my values to my work where they aligned. I had a lot of knowledge and I needed an outlet. So find opportunities. The work I was doing for the university included shared assets for use across online library tools and a one-page style guide. But we have a distributed web environment with up to 300 folks contributing content and development. And we lacked a shared vision. A web design project came up and a smaller site around 500 pages. So I made a pitch that aligned their goals with some of my principles, and we chose to move forward. This gave us a practical pilot for what this work could look like. We recently applied it at a much larger scale and are working on finding the balance between needs or wants and values. The work also led to a design system. I realize we're 5 minutes over. If you haven't heard of a design system, it's a tool that provides a broad range of support for a shared vision of web work. It's essentially a website of documentation. I won't go into what these sections are, but know that the work is based, all of it's based within those grounding principles. So I wouldn't suggest that everyone here start their own web design system. I do see design systems as a maturation of the web, a way to collaborate and share values between colleagues, to grow together, learn from one another, and create a consistent online experience. However, that's not the only form this work can take, as long as we're thinking, learning, and doing. To review, here are those 7 steps again. Embrace that we aren't perfect. Explore, observe, and find community. Analyze your own work, write it down. Commit, apply, and find opportunities. In the book Emergent Strategy, Adrienne Marie Brown wrote, "Matter doesn't disappear, it transforms. Energy is the same way. The earth is layer upon layer of all that has existed, remembered by the dirt. What do we want the earth to remember us by?" All right, thank you. Thank you everyone who could stay. And so there's a question if the design system is publicly available. It is, but I have to admit, I'm a little ashamed of it at the moment. I mentioned we just did a much larger project. And in that we made a lot of changes, and I have not yet had time to update it. But I'm more than happy to share it with the CAT community once I have finally carved out that time, and I'm hoping in the next month.